The lie was absolute. It was meticulously crafted, repeated by state media, amplified by bot farms, and eventually swallowed by a confused global public. They told us this war was about security. They told us it was about history, about NATO encroachment, about the protection of Russian speakers in the Donbass. But if you strip away the rhetoric and look purely at the data, a completely different picture emerges. The invasion of Ukraine was never about the past. It was a desperate, violent bid to secure the future of a dying empire. To understand why Russia lied to the whole world, we must stop listening to their diplomats and start looking at their geologists, their demographers, and their accountants. Because the truth isn't found in speeches, it is found in the ground, in the birth rates, and in the melting ice of the Arctic. Let's begin with the most tangible lie, the objective of the war itself. The Kremlin framed this as a defensive measure. But if you overlay a geological survey map onto the map of Russian-occupied territories in Ukraine, the coincidence is impossible to ignore. Russia didn't just seize land, they seized the periodic table. The Donbass region, often dismissed as a rust belt of old coal mines, actually sits on top of one of the largest untapped reserves of lithium and titanium in Europe. In the 21st century, lithium is the new oil. It is the lifeblood of the electric vehicle revolution, the battery storage grids, and the entire green economy. Titanium is the bone structure of modern aerospace and defense. By occupying these specific territories, Russia didn't just take cities. They attempted a hostile corporate takeover of Europe's resource future. They know that whoever controls these minerals holds the West hostage for the next 50 years. The lie of denazification was a smokescreen for a multi-trillion-dollar resource heist. But the theft wasn't just about minerals. It was about people. And this brings us to the second, more terrifying lie, the lie of Russian strength. For 2 decades, Vladimir Putin projected the image of a resurgent superpower, a bear that had awakened from hibernation. But internally, the Kremlin was looking at a spreadsheet that spelled doom. Russia is in the midst of a catastrophic demographic collapse. The population is aging, the birth rate is plummeting, and the death rate fueled by alcoholism, poor healthcare, and despair is skyrocketing. Before the war, projections showed that by 2050, Russia would simply run out of military-age men to defend its 11 time zones. This is where the cold calculus of the invasion comes in. They didn't just want Ukraine's land, they desperately needed Ukraine's 40 million people. They needed to plug Ukraine's demographics into their own dying system to keep the Russian machine running for another century. This explains the systematic kidnapping of children, the forced issuance of Russian passports, and the filtration camps. It was not just conquest, it was a biological absorption. The lie was that they were liberating a brotherly people. The truth is that they were cannibalizing them to survive. However, the deception extends far beyond the borders of Ukraine. The greatest geopolitical magic trick Russia performed was distracting the world with tanks in the mud while they made their real move in the ice. While the eyes of the world were fixed on Kyiv and Kharkiv, Russia was quietly achieving dominance in the Arctic. They lied about their scientific intentions in the North Pole. For years, they built military bases, airfields, and deep-water ports in the frozen north, preparing for a reality that only they seemed willing to bet on: the melting of the polar ice caps. Russia knows that as the ice melts, the northern sea route becomes navigable. This route cuts the shipping time between Asia and Europe by 40%. It is the most valuable emerging trade route on the planet. By controlling the Arctic coastline, Russia aims to become the toll booth of global trade. They want to hold the keys to the maritime highway of the future. The war in Ukraine serves as a brutal distraction, a way to exhaust Western ammunition and political will, while Moscow secures the strategic assets that will matter in 2040. They are trading the present for the future, sacrificing thousands of soldiers today to secure a trade monopoly for their grandchildren. Yet, there is a flaw in this grand strategy, a variable they lied about even to themselves: the economic cost. The Kremlin told the world that the Russian economy was a fortress, sanctions-proof and resilient. They pointed to their gold reserves and their energy exports as proof of invincibility. But this was an accounting trick. In reality, the war has forced Russia to cannibalize its own future to survive the present. To keep the war machine running, Putin has had to burn through the National Wealth Fund, stripping the country of the safety net meant for future generations. More dangerously, the lie of economic resilience hides a profound shift in global power. By cutting ties with the West, Russia didn't become independent. It became a vassal. The pivot to Asia, celebrated by Russian propaganda as a masterstroke of multipolar diplomacy, is in practice a surrender to China. Russia is now entirely dependent on Beijing for its technology, its consumer goods, and its market for oil and gas. China knows this. They are buying Russian resources at a massive discount, essentially treating Russia not as a partner, but as a resource colony. The lie was that Russia was fighting the US to end American hegemony. The truth is that Russia destroyed its own sovereignty and handed the keys of the Kremlin to the Chinese Communist Party. This internal rot is visible in the very structure of the Russian state today. The lie of stability under Putin masks a system that has become dangerously brittle. To maintain the war effort, the economy has been transformed into a primitive military-industrial complex. Factories are churning out tanks instead of cars, artillery shells instead of consumer electronics. This creates a fake GDP growth numbers that look good on paper because government spending is high, but which represent no real value for the citizens. You cannot eat a tank, you cannot live inside a missile. The standard of living is eroding, inflation is hidden but rampant, and the brain drain of the country's best engineers and IT specialists has left a void that cannot be filled. Russia is effectively eating its own muscle to feed the war. Furthermore, the narrative of national unity is perhaps the most fragile lie of all. The regime has convinced the population that they are under existential threat from the West, a siege mentality that justifies any sacrifice. But this social contract is fraying. The heavy losses at the front are disproportionately borne by the ethnic minorities from the poorest regions: Dagestan, Buryatia, Tuva, Moscow, and St. Petersburg remain relatively insulated, a deliberate strategy to prevent political unrest in the centers of power. But as the war drags on, as the economic pain seeps into the cities, and as the caskets return home, the illusion of unity will crack. The lie can only hold as long as the fear of the external enemy outweighs the misery of the internal reality. We must also look at the lie regarding NATO. The narrative that NATO expansion forced Russia's hand is historically illiterate. NATO is a defensive alliance that was struggling for purpose before 2022. It was brain dead, as Macron famously put it. Russia's invasion didn't stop NATO, it revitalized it. It pushed Finland and Sweden, nations that remained neutral even during the height of the Cold War, straight into the alliance. By lying about the threat of NATO, Russia created the very encirclement they claimed to fear. They turned the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake. This wasn't a strategic masterstroke, it was a strategic suicide driven by paranoia and false data. Ultimately, the reason Russia lied to the whole world is because the truth was an admission of failure. To tell the truth would be to admit that the post-Soviet transition had failed to build a modern, diversified state. To tell the truth would be to admit that the only way Russia knows how to compete is through brute force and coercion, not innovation or culture. The lie is not just a tactic, it is the foundation of the current Russian identity. It is a shield against the humiliation of decline. But lies have a shelf life. You can fake GDP numbers, you can fake election results, and you can fake historical narratives. But you cannot fake logistics, you cannot fake demographics. You cannot fake the fact that your commercial airplanes are flying without maintenance because you can't get parts. You cannot fake the reality that your younger generation has fled to Tbilisi, Dubai, and Belgrade. The force ratio is shifting against them, not on the battlefield of Avdiivka, but on the battlefield of reality. The world is slowly waking up to the scale of the deception. The global south, initially sympathetic to Russia's anti-colonial rhetoric, is seeing the food prices rise and the instability spread. China is watching a junior partner that is becoming a liability. And the West, despite its slow start, is realizing that this is not a diplomatic misunderstanding, but a long-term containment struggle against a rogue actor. Russia lied because the truth was terminal. They lied to buy time. They lied to keep the population quiet. They lied to make the West hesitate. But the fog of war eventually lifts. And when it does, what will remain is not a restored empire, but a hollowed-out state, mortgaged to China, depleted of its youth, and isolated in a prison of its own making. The tragedy is that the Russian people, fed on a diet of imperial nostalgia and manufactured victimhood, will be the ones to pay the debts incurred by these lies for generations to come. This is the autopsy of a superpower that refused to adapt and chose instead to burn down the house rather than admit the roof was leaking. But the autopsy is not finished. To fully understand the scope of the lie, we must look away from the snow of Ukraine and turn our eyes to the sands of the Sahel. While the world watches the front line in Donbass, Russia is conducting a shadow war in Africa. This is not about diplomacy, it is about survival. Through the Wagner Group, now rebranded as the Africa Corps, Moscow has secured access to gold mines in Sudan, Mali, and the Central African Republic. Why? Because gold is the only currency that sanctions cannot touch. They are looting the African continent to subsidize the war in Europe. They are trading security for dictators in exchange for bullion to prop up the ruble. The lie they tell Africans is anti-colonialism. The reality is neo-imperialism purely for resource extraction. And finally, we must address the most irreversible cost of this war: the technological suicide. We are living in the decade of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and the new space race. These technologies will define the hierarchy of nations for the next century. But because of the war, Russia has excluded itself from this race entirely. The sanctions have cut off access to high-end microchips, the isolation has severed ties with global scientific communities, and the mobilization has sent their brightest young coders and engineers fleeing to the West. Russia is fighting a 20th century artillery war, while the rest of the world is building the 21st century economy. They are burning their furniture to keep the house warm for one more winter. So, what is the final force ratio? Russia has traded its long-term potential for short-term territorial gain. They have gained ruins in Bakhmut but lost their place in the future. The lie was that this war would make Russia great again. The truth is, it has turned a global power into a regional nuisance with nuclear weapons. The lie has worked for now, but history has a way of balancing the books. And when the bill finally comes due, it won't be Putin who pays it. It will be the silence of a nation that realized too late they were not the heroes of this story. They were the victims of it. If you want to see through the fog of war and understand the mathematics behind the headlines, this is the channel you need. The mainstream media gives you the narrative. We give you the raw data. Subscribe to Force Ratio. Turn on notifications. We are just getting started.